Somewhere on Earth right now, out of every 50 people who pass you on the street, only one of them is carrying something that scientists still don't fully understand. It isn't a rare disease. It isn't a hidden talent. It's sitting right in the open, in plain sight, in the most obvious part of their face. It's the color of their eyes. Green eyes. And when a team of geneticists finally sat down to map out exactly how they form, what they found wasn't a simple answer. It was a chain of biological coincidences so specific, so improbable, that some of the researchers themselves described the result as stranger than they expected going in. Because here is the detail that changes everything you think you know about eye color. There is no green pigment in a human eye. Not a trace of it. Not anywhere. And once you understand what your eyes are actually doing, instead, you may never look at a green-eyed face the same way again. For most of the last century, the explanation people were handed for eye color was almost insultingly simple. Brown beats blue. That was the whole idea. You inherited one version of a color gene from your mother and one from your father. The dominant one won, and the recessive one lost. It was the kind of thing you could sketch on a whiteboard in a few seconds, hand out a worksheet, and let a classroom of teenagers predict what color a hypothetical baby's eyes would be. 2 blue-eyed parents, a blue-eyed child guaranteed. It felt tidy. It felt like biology, behaving exactly the way people wanted biology to behave, in clean boxes with clean outcomes. The trouble is that real families never behaved like that worksheet. 2 brown-eyed parents would have a child with startlingly blue eyes, something that should have been close to impossible under the old model. Siblings raised in the same house, sharing the same 2 parents and the same pool of inherited DNA, would end up with completely different eye colors from one another. One with deep brown, one with gray, one with a green that seemed to shift depending on the light. For a long time, scientists filed these cases away as exceptions, oddities that didn't need to threaten the underlying rule. But exceptions have a way of accumulating until they can no longer be ignored. And eventually researchers with access to large-scale genomic sequencing decided to test the classic model directly against real human DNA. What they found didn't just complicate the picture. It replaced it entirely. Eye color, it turns out, isn't controlled by 1 gene, or 2, or even 3. Multiple genome-wide studies have identified around 16 different genes that each contribute a small piece to the final outcome, some adding pigment, some limiting it, some influencing the physical structure of the eye itself. This is what biologists call a polygenic trait, a characteristic assembled not from a single instruction, but from a whole committee of genes voting at once. The same basic architecture that determines something like human height. Nobody has a single tall gene. Height is the sum of dozens of small genetic nudges added together. Eye color works on the same principle, except instead of producing a single number on a growth chart, it produces a color your brain perceives when light bounces back out of your iris. 2 of those 16 genes matter far more than the rest, and they sit right next to each other on chromosome 15. The first is called OCA2. Its job is to carry the instructions for a protein, appropriately called the P protein, that governs how much melanin gets deposited into the iris. Melanin is the same pigment responsible for the color of your skin and your hair, and inside the eye, it behaves exactly the way it does everywhere else in the body. It absorbs light, and the more of it there is, the darker the surface appears. Picture OCA2 as a volume knob for pigment. Turn it all the way up, and the iris fills with enough melanin to produce a brown so deep it can look almost black in dim light. Turn it down, and you move toward lighter browns, then hazel, then the paler end of the spectrum. But OCA2 doesn't set its own volume. Sitting immediately next to it on that same chromosome is a second gene, HERK2, and HERK2 doesn't make any pigment at all. What it does instead is regulate how active OCA2 is allowed to be. Researchers studying this region found that deep inside HERK2, in a stretch of DNA that doesn't even code for a protein, there's a single genetic switch, a spot geneticists label RS129138832, where one letter of DNA can differ from person to person. That single letter functions as what's known as an enhancer. When it's one version, it strengthens the physical connection between HERK2 and the OCA2 promoter, effectively turning OCA2's pigment production up. When it's the other version, the connection weakens. OCA2 quiets down, and less melanin makes it into the iris. Multiple published studies have shown that this one variant can predict blue versus brown eye color with something like 90% accuracy across European populations. A strikingly reliable result for a single position out of the roughly 3 billion letters that make up the human genome. It's one of the clearest examples geneticists have found of how a tiny non-coding change in DNA can ripple upward into something as visible as eye color across a room. That single switch, though, mostly explains one axis: darker eyes versus lighter eyes, brown against blue. It does an excellent job with that particular question. What it does not explain on its own is green. Because green isn't simply a stop along that same dial, sitting a little lower than blue or a little higher than hazel. Researchers who tried to explain green using pigment alone kept running into a wall, because pigment alone was never the full story. To understand where green actually comes from, you have to stop thinking about eye color purely as a matter of pigment and start thinking about it as a combination of pigment and physics. Here is the detail that surprises almost everyone who first hears it. There is no green pigment anywhere in the human eye. Not a single molecule of it. No matter how vividly green a pair of eyes looks, there is nothing inside that iris that is actually tinted the color of moss or emerald. The green you're seeing isn't a substance. It's an effect, something the eye is doing to light, rather than something the eye contains. To see how that effect is built, it helps to look at how the iris is structured. The front layer, the part you're looking at when you meet someone's gaze, is called the stroma. It isn't a solid sheet of color. It's a loose, semi-transparent mesh of collagen fibers, threaded through with a small amount of a pale yellowish pigment called lipochrome. The collagen matters just as much as the pigment because of what happens when light strikes it. When light hits that fine mesh of fibers, shorter wavelengths, the blues, scatter more easily than longer wavelengths like reds and oranges, and more of that scattered blue light bounces back out of the eye toward whoever is looking at it. This is the same basic phenomenon, called Rayleigh scattering, that makes the sky appear blue. The sky isn't blue because it's painted that color. It's blue because sunlight scatters off molecules in the atmosphere, and blue wavelengths scatter the most. A blue human iris works the same way on a much smaller scale, a nearly colorless stroma with very little melanin behind it, scattering light back in a way the brain interprets as blue. Now layer the yellow lipochrome pigment on top of that structural blue. The same way mixing a wash of yellow over blue on a painter's palette produces green. A thin layer of yellow pigment sitting over that scattered blue light produces the visual effect of green. That's the entire mechanism. Green eyes are structural blue light, generated by scattering off collagen fibers, viewed through a soft filter of yellow pigment. Blue physics plus yellow pigment equals a green appearance, and there is no green molecule involved in the equation at all. Once you see it that way, the rest of the spectrum stops looking like a set of separate categories and starts looking like a single continuous dial. A little more lipochrome and a touch more melanin, and the green warms toward amber or hazel. A little less pigment, and the same eye drifts toward a pale, almost gray blue. This also explains something hazel-eyed people have insisted on for years, often to skeptical friends who assumed they were exaggerating. Hazel eyes really do seem to shift color depending on the light and even the clothing someone is wearing. That's not imagination. It comes from uneven melanin distribution across the iris interacting with that same scattering effect. So different lighting conditions genuinely bring out different components of the underlying blend. The gold or amber ring some people have close to the pupil, a trait called central heterochromia, comes from the same basic phenomenon, with melanin clustered unevenly and catching light differently at the center of the eye than at its edge. Given how specific and layered this system is, it would be reasonable to assume green eyes are ancient, something that's been drifting quietly through human populations for tens of thousands of years. Ancient DNA tells a different story. When researchers sequenced the genomes of early European populations, they found that for most of human history, essentially everyone alive had dark eyes, dark hair, and dark skin. The genetic variants behind lighter eyes are, on an evolutionary timescale, remarkably recent. with the strongest evidence pointing to a period roughly 6 to 10,000 years ago in populations connected to the region around the Black Sea and the Pontic-Caspian steppe, later spreading outward through migration into northern and central Europe. A landmark study of ancient genomes, published in 2015, detected an extremely strong signal of natural selection acting on the HERC2 and OCA2 region in prehistoric Europeans, a statistical signature so pronounced that something was clearly favoring lighter eye color at the time, even though researchers are still debating exactly why. Some have proposed connections to vitamin D synthesis in low sunlight environments, others to sexual selection, and others simply to the founder effect of small migrating populations. None of these explanations has been proven beyond doubt, and the honest answer from the scientific literature is that the selective pressure is well documented, while its underlying cause is still an open question. What isn't in dispute is the rarity. Across large population surveys, green eyes consistently come out as the least common of the standard eye colors, found in roughly 2% of people worldwide, compared with something like 70 to 79% for brown eyes and 8 to 10% for blue. Hazel and amber sit in between, each accounting for a small single-digit percentage. In the United States specifically, self-reported surveys have found green eyes at a noticeably higher rate, close to 9%, largely a reflection of the country's mixed European ancestry rather than any difference in the biology itself. Regionally, the picture shifts even more. In Ireland and Scotland, combined rates of blue and green eyes run remarkably high, a direct echo of the ancestral populations that carried these variants north and west across Europe over thousands of years. Outside of Europe and populations with European ancestry, green eyes remain extremely uncommon, which is part of why the trait draws so much attention wherever it appears. There's a practical footnote to all of this that's worth knowing, not just as trivia. Because green irises carry less protective melanin than brown ones, people with lighter eye colors have a somewhat elevated risk of certain sun-related eye conditions, including a rare form of eye cancer called uveal melanoma. It isn't a reason for alarm, but it is a legitimate, well-documented reason to take UV protection seriously and wear sunglasses that block ultraviolet light, something ophthalmologists frequently recommend specifically for people with lighter irises. Perhaps the strangest part of this entire picture is how unstable green eyes are by nature. Because the color depends on a specific, narrow balance between collagen scattering and a thin layer of yellow pigment, it's remarkably easy to nudge off course. A slightly higher deposit of melanin and the eye tips toward hazel, slightly less lipochrome, and it drifts toward a pale, almost gray blue. This is part of why full siblings, drawing from the exact same two parents, can end up scattered across noticeably different shades. They aren't inheriting entirely different genetic material, just tiny variations layered on top of the same underlying combination. It also means that green eyes genuinely do look different depending on the light hitting them at any given moment, which is why photographs so often fail to capture them accurately. What you're seeing when you look at green eyes isn't a fixed, stored color the way ink is fixed on a page. It's closer to an ongoing event, produced fresh each moment by light interacting with a specific structure, which is part of why the color can shift from a warm hazel green under a lamp to a cooler, mossier tone under an overcast sky, even though nothing about the underlying eye has changed at all. So the tidy version most people were taught in school, a single dominant gene beating a single recessive one, was never an accurate description of what's actually happening. The real story is a layered conversation between at least 16 genes, anchored by two dominant players on chromosome 15, filtered through a physical scattering effect borrowed from the same physics that colors the sky, and traced back to a genetic variant that appears to have spread through European populations only a few thousand years ago under unusually strong selective pressure, whose exact cause is still being investigated. Green eyes aren't a fixed pigment sitting quietly in the iris, waiting to be seen. They're closer to a precise, ongoing collaboration between structure, light, and inheritance, a trait recent enough, in evolutionary terms, that it may still be spreading and settling into new populations today. If you have green eyes yourself, it's worth remembering that what you're looking at in the mirror isn't paint. It's physics, running in real time, every time the light hits your eyes.